questions. We ask them all day, but often, and how well do we ask them in our leadership role? How do you use questions to help you be a more effective coach? And if you had greater skills and confidence in asking questions, how would that change your results and outcomes as a leader? It's a great question. And these are questions that matter, and they're the kinds of questions we're going to explore during this episode. So welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders like you grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger positive difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this show in the future, you could join us live on your favorite social media channel. You can find out when those are happening and how you can get connected, and therefore see them / hear them sooner and get the beautiful, wonderful ideas into your practice sooner. And you can do all that by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups, just two of the platforms where you can watch. Go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to be LinkedIn and know what's going on. Today's episode is brought to you by my latest book, Flexible Leadership: Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. It's time to realize that styles can get in our way and that following our strengths might not always be the best approach. In a world more complex and uncertain than ever, leaders need a new perspective and a new set of tools to create the great results their organizations and teams need. And that's what Flexible Leadership provides you. Learn more and order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/flexible. And after all of that, we've got the administration out of the way. Let me bring in my guest. Looks like we might have a technical challenge. Let me check on that really quickly. See if that works. And if it does, great. And if it doesn't, we'll move on. We're going to move on. So let me introduce my guest. His name is Dave Reynolds. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He is a serial entrepreneur who has launched and developed a variety of new products and services for nearly 2 decades. He is the founder and CEO of the Ruminate Group, a growth consulting firm that helps clients think strategically, facilitate team growth, and navigate crucial conversations. With a background in sales leadership, performance management, and succession planning, Dave is passionate about growth, acceleration, and how asking the right questions yields the best answers. He explores those passions in his new book, Radicle: Growth, Transform into an Unstoppable Leader Through Mastering the Art of Questions. I mentioned he's in another country than me. He's in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada today. And so, hey, welcome, Dave. So glad that you're here.
Appreciate it. Thanks very much, Kevin, for having me. And fantastic introduction.
I took the one your mother gave me. So let's see. We've got someone here that's in Vienna, and we've got someone who's here in Houston, and we're glad that that they and others are with us. So what I want to do, Dave, is sort of start out by making an assumption, and you can tell me if my assumption is correct, that when you were like, I don't know, 8 years old, you probably weren't expecting to be a person who's written books and that sort of thing. I don't know, maybe you thought you were going to be a hockey player. I don't know. But my question is, like, tell us a little bit more about the journey in short that leads you to this place and the writing of this book.
Yeah, it's funny when I look back and where I would have been 8. I think I always knew I was going to be a salesperson in some way, from persuasion and just being talkative, but never thought that I would wind up here. And so anybody ever asks, it's kind of a serendipitous moment of how one area drove me to the next. So it's been really exciting and navigating to entrepreneurship, from inventing new products to launching new products to getting into consultancy just by, asking a lot of really intuitive questions to a friend of mine that led to, hey, why don't you start consulting for me? And I said yes, and we'll figure it out.
So here you are. So why the book specifically? You and I were talking before the show started, before we hit record, a little bit about what the book's doing for you since it came out. But like, why? What led you to decide to write the book?
Yeah, well, 2 things. I think it was always on a bucket list. that I always just said, I really want to write a book. I was just always in admiration of people that wrote. But the second part was we serve clients kind of all over the world, very industry agnostic. And we were going through the process of doing a lot of executive coaching for their teams. And they were just seeing so much growth. And the CEO said, geez, if you could just package this in, a book or a program, she said you could do really well with this. And so I didn't think about it until later that night, and I always got the abundance mentality that said, yeah, we should share this, we should give this out, even though a lot of people try and keep those tactics in. So we actually developed an actual training program, but we actually led with the book first, and that's what's got us here. So the CEO, I was in admiration and thankful that they said, hey, you know what, you should put this in a book.
I love that. So, in true salesman uh, fashion, I suppose, you you make a pretty big promise in the subtitle. You say, transform into an unstoppable leader. So let's talk about that word unstoppable just for a minute, because it's a big promise. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm confident that you use the word intentionally. So let's just talk about that a little bit. Why unstoppable? And is it really true that if we master the art of questions, we can become unstoppable?
Yeah, amazing question. And I think that I've actually never been asked that before, but the reason why we created that subtitle was that the leaders that we've worked with that really start going through and seeing the value of asking questions, it really starts breaking through the limitations that a lot of people set for themselves, not just individually, but teams and organizations. Because we start to think differently when we ask questions, we increase our level of ownership and our level of accountability, which overall, increases our level of execution. And a common question I ask clients that I work with is, hey, if you went back 2 years to where we started and you kind of saw yourself today, what would you say? And they're really kind of dumbfounded that they said, like, I wouldn't even know the person I am today. And I think that being a leader that masters the art of questions is you can create leaders that create leaders. And it really can kind of change your future just by really grabbing that skill and mastering it.
So one of the things that you talk about throughout the book, and it really is, I think, hinted at in everything you've said so far, is that you're a believer in creating a culture of coaching. And I said in the opening that you can't detach coaching from questions. So what do you mean, Dave, when you say a coaching culture? How would I know? Why would I want it?
Yep.
And how would I know if I'm moving towards it?
Yeah, and so we are always in an area where a lot of people want a strategy. They want the strategy that's going to work, and that could be a coaching methodology. But it's the idea that culture and strategy, and I think the old saying was that culture eats strategy for breakfast. We really want to make sure coaching culture isn't just about introducing, say, radical growth as a strategy. Is we want radical growth to be part of organization's culture. So they're sharing the terminology, they're owning implementation, and coaching is being done everywhere in the organization. You'll see in the book we talk about coaching up, coaching down, and coaching across. Coaching shouldn't always have to be a leader to an employee. It should be peer to peer. You should feel comfortable to lead up. And that's when we really see organizations that embrace coaching culture. And that is an incredible thing because you don't feel like you need to lead in only one direction. It can be multidimensional. And that's when we see the biggest influence of our growth is when we see, coaching culture take flourish.
All right. So we want to create a coaching culture, and we've said that questions are a big part of it. And so I want to talk about, as we promised in the episode title, talk about the art of questions. But before we get to the art, you say there's also a science to questions. So tell me about the science of questions before we dive into the art.
Yeah, it was interesting when we were working with our publisher on this, and we were kind of said, hey, there's an art and science to it, because you can see when you watch somebody ask a question, it looks like you couldn't replicate that same process. But the science side is we really go on the idea of when you're being asked a question versus being given direction, there's a totally different neurological response on how you actually own the response because you have a sense of ownership over it. And that's like when we talk about storytelling and neurocoupling, like there is an actual relationship that you're creating by asking somebody a question versus telling them what they need to do. And this is really where we get more people involved in the commitment stage because the answers are coming from them. So they have a sense of empowerment by providing those answers. And in a lot of cases, we all know great questions, you have to ask multiple. So you can't live at a surface level. You have to get deeper. And people get a stronger self awareness over being asked deeper questions. So we get a lot of aha moments where they're having those realizations. And you can actually see their body language change when you can tell that they've had that dialogue internally the whole time and they'll say it. And our response right away is that the first time you said that out loud? And they're like, yeah. And when they vocalize it, it just changes their relationship with the response.
Yeah, thoughts are fuzzy, words bring clarity. We can think about things a long time, but when we say them or write them, it changes everything. And I often say, Dave, that people don't argue with their own data, right? So once people have said something,
Fair point.
that's a big part of where that ownership piece comes into play. So I really appreciate that we started there. So and by the way, everybody, in case you're wondering, to think that this is an easy conversation for me to have when the guy who wrote the book about questions is here, and I'm sure he's mentally thinking about critiquing how well I'm doing at asking questions. So I want to talk about barriers because, like, so far, everyone would say, yeah, questions are good, all good.
Yep.
It's like in the U.S. we'd say that's motherhood and apple pie. Like, of course, better questions, and yet there are barriers, especially as leaders. There are things that sort of keep us from doing it. And this to me is one of the most important conversations for us to have here. And I hope that everyone who's listening is like ready to take notes here. Like from your perspective and in your experience, Dave, what are the barriers?
Yeah. The immediate barrier that I would go to right away would be that more relationships have ended by what wasn't said than what was said. So I'd say more people just avoid asking questions or having the conversation. That would be one of them. And the second would be, and we've already mentioned, is they ask questions and they accept surface level responses. So, hey, how's your day going? It's good. How are sales? Good. And we accept these surface level responses versus, excuse me, you're asking, amazing. What's good? And especially in sales, and they're saying, "Oh, well," and you're asking, "Well, what's your goal for the month?" And you're going a little bit deeper. So surface level for sure. Looking for reframe questions. So if somebody says, "I don't know," sometimes people might ask, "If you did know, what would you say?" And sometimes you just have to look at different tactics like mirroring. And I would say the biggest barriers are people avoiding the conversations. I would say living at the surface level. And then I'll probably add another point is being proactive with your questions versus reactive. So a lot of times where somebody might ask a question reactively, you might be actually stimulating an emotional response versus a logical response. So that would be really what I would say some of the biggest barriers are because when you're asking proactive questions, you're invested in the conversation versus you're looking at checking a box in a reactive environment.
One of the things that I find, so speak to this if you want. One of the things that I find for leaders a lot of times is that they're afraid of asking because they don't know how to respond to the answer,
Mm.
or they don't ask because they think they already know.
Yep.
Comments about either one of those thoughts?
Yeah, and I think like it's like, can I be a subject matter expert? Can I respond to that? So people will feel like they need to immediately respond, and there's actually something really graceful about pausing and asking for a moment to think about that. And if anything, it actually stimulates a deeper conversation. I really agree with you a lot on that. Is like having to feel like you need to know all the answers. Actually, if anything, when I enter an organization, the reason why we're industry agnostic is sometimes the less I know, the more I can help. And so what I mean by that is if I'm just curious, I don't have to really be the technical expert, but I can actually pull more information out of the person I'm working with and get it into a better system just by being curious versus, hey, this is how I've done it. This is how you should do it. And that for me has been a great approach.
Yeah, I really do love that a lot. I want you mentioned something in the book, and I think this gets at this point. if as we get better at asking questions, we can do what you suggest here. You suggest that we need to move from being transactional to being transformational. Uh, what do you mean, and what's the difference?
Yeah, transactional we see a lot of times, especially coaching in certain environments. They're kind of ad hoc. They're doing it because they have to do it, not because they want to do it. It might be a KPI or a metric that needs to be met to have coaching. Transformational is going, I'm making an intentional, proactive investment in coaching. And I remember Eve actually being in telecommunications. We had to coach a certain amount of time. But once I started shifting into seeing coaching as my competitive advantage for growth, I really started realizing, oh, wow, by having consistent coaching conversations, I'm actually creating more dynamic leaders, higher performing sales executors. And not only am I making them better, I'm actually teaching them a skill that's transferable to their team members. So the transformation happens on also getting people outside of their comfort zone, but we're doing it in a way that they're really owning that process along the way. So that's really where we see a lot of transformation, is really about getting them into that growth mindset, but also pushing them outside of their comfort zone in an area that they're owning the next steps.
I think it's interesting that the way you describe that shift for you was a transformation, going from I have to coach to I get to coach, or I want to coach, or there's great value in me coaching. And anytime, and so that same transformation hopefully is occurring for all of you listening, in terms of it's okay for me to ask questions. I want to ask questions. I can ask better questions. And if I'm going to ask better questions, one of the things we need to know is what are the kinds of questions we can ask. So we learned a little bit of this in school, but we've all slept since then. But you take us a step further in that. So when you think about it today, for us in the workplace as coaches, as team members, what are
Yep.
the types of questions we should be considering?
Yeah. So when we look at just your basic open-ended questions, I think anybody that's on this show is listening. We're already doing these open-ended questions. We're asking bigger, broad questions. But what I'll challenge everybody on around open-ended questions is start with big and broad open-ended questions, so you can ask an open-ended question, so people feel comfortable and they give momentum into answering questions. And then you could be more specific with an open-ended question to get more detail. I really feel that asking confirming questions is a really great strategy for two reasons. It shows you're listening, because as a confirming statement, you're having to say, just to clarify, what you just mentioned was, and you'll go through the area of just telling, I heard what you said. Is that the most important next step that you're seeing? And then they're using that opportunity to kind of confirm that. Those are really great. One that's had a big impact, we've worked with a couple of big project management teams, is actually leveraging mirroring questions. And we have an example of this in the book. And I remember one of our clients was saying, "Oh, just, we're really stuck. They're just not being helpful. And I know they're off track, but they won't admit they're off track." And we went through this whole area where I said, okay, grab a timer, and here's a set of questions we went through. And so when she did a project update, say, hey, can you give us an update on the project? And she said, yeah, the project's going well. And the goal with mirroring is always saying the last three words that the person said in a mirroring fashion. So she said, the project's going well. Put on the timer. Let the silence happen. 18 seconds went by, which probably felt like 2 days. And they said,
It felt like 2 days. I have stories I can tell you about that. 100% it felt like forever. Okay, but 18 seconds later, what happened?
18 seconds later, they said, well, we've run into a couple roadblocks. And she said, okay, you've had a couple roadblocks. Again, hit the timer. So she said she went for 15 seconds, and they came out with, we've got some, issues with timing. We don't know why the budget's off course. And we're seeing all these things. And she did still keep doing the mirroring activity until they got into a deeper conversation. She said the relationship was never the same after that. It was perfectly on point, where they were engaged, they were part of the process, because they were worried about putting things on the table. But when you give people space and timing to really respond, but you give them in an area where they really have to own the truth, that is where mirroring really truly comes into practice. And it's such an exciting activity, but extremely difficult to wait 18 seconds for somebody to respond.
That's a long time. But here's the thing: the longer you're waiting, the more you're, especially if there's positional power, which you describe here, right? The coach,
Yep.
the boss, the leader person. Um, the longer we're waiting, the more we're showing them that it's okay, that we really do want to know, that we're not just asking the questions on the checklist, that we really want to know, uh, and that space is giving that person time to think that through, think it out, decide how they want to say it, to your point earlier, and it can make all the difference. That's a drastic length of time. Let me just tell all of you, it probably won't always take that long, but I love that strategy, that mirroring strategy. And you used something similar earlier in the conversation when you said, someone answered, I don't know. Well, if you did know, what would you say? I thought that was a brilliant question, and I wanted to bring it back in case someone missed it before. It's a great question. If you did know, what would you say? Because that's setting the person up to have enough confidence to say what they're probably thinking, right?
Absolutely.
I just love that question. I want to make sure that everyone sort of had that locked in for themselves.
Well, on a
So,
fun life hack, Kevin, I was driving the other day with my girlfriend, and we said, honey, where would you like to go eat? And you know what she said? Ah, it doesn't matter to me. And then I said, well, if it did matter, where would you like to go? And she said right away the exact spot where she wanted to go. I was like, oh, this is working.
you just salvage relationships right there, Dave. You didn't even know that. You saw, if you're watching everybody, I kind of went like this because everybody that's in a long-term relationship has had that conversation. Uh, I
Agreed.
promise you that they have, and what a great way to do that by using mirroring questions. We talked about open-ended questions, starting broad and getting more specific. We talked about confirming questions or paraphrasing questions. We talked about mirroring questions. Any other question types you want to talk about before we move on?
Yeah, I would say to go back to the idea of surface level elements, I would go into more of the probing questions. And I would say this is where leaders can probably strengthen the most is that, just asking probing questions. And that doesn't mean asking the same question. It's a matter of looking at a sequence of questions. And I remember walking with the CEO by kind of one of the sales teams, and CEO kind of wanted to show me how to connection with everybody. And he talked to the sales manager. He said, oh, hey, our sales. The sales manager said, oh, they're good. And I walked by and I could see I was close enough with him that I said, "Perfect, hey, sales are good." I said, "How's your month going?" He said, "Pretty good." He still give me similar responses. Like, "What was your goal for the month?" And they shared their goal, and I said, "Amazing! Like, where are you at month to date?" He shares it, and I said, "Okay, interesting." I said, "Are you on track to hit your goal?" And he said, "Well, not really." And I said, "Okay, interesting. So sales are good." And we just kind of had a fun way of challenging each other. He said, "Well, these are some of the areas that we're stalling in," and it was interesting because you had to go 3 or 4 layers deeper. But it was interesting. I walked in the office next week, the CEO, and he came up and said, "Hey, we're back on track." And so it was interesting by probing and caring and investing, we created a relationship with each other that he felt that he wanted to share, having committed to making a change, versus getting away with a surface level question and going back to not being on track.
So that highlights two things, everybody. Number one is it's something that we said before. By asking the question, you get people out of their head and putting words to it, which changes their understanding as well as the commitment, as you said. But the other thing that questions do for us is they can be a way to build relationship. And if we,
Big
as
time.
leaders, want to be more effective as leaders, we want to have better working relationships with our folks. Questions one of the very best ways that we can do that. So let's talk about follow-up questions, right? Like,
Mm.
or follow-up in general. Let's spend a couple minutes there before we sort of round into the final turn here.
Yeah, I would say follow up systems and follow up questions are probably what has helped us drive the strongest ROI for organizations and probably the strongest systems that we teach when we're teaching the coaching process is that every time that you're finishing, say, coaching or a conversation, there should be a commitment to some form of action that comes from the person you're coaching. Now, there's 2 scenarios that people are used to: a coach that follows up and a coach that doesn't. A coach that doesn't, okay, I got away with it. Accountability drops. The coach that starts the next session by saying, what actions do we commit to on our last session? And they talk through them. Amazing. Can you walk me through how that went? Or how did that go? And if you create that environment of accountability, that follow up system not only holds them accountable to being the best version of them, but they know somebody's also invested in their success because they cared enough to follow up to make sure that they executed. And that's not only created a great investment between the two of us or the group that we're coaching with, um, they just feel like they've got somebody in their corner. And a lot of people see accountability as punishment. Accountability for us is motivation to go farther.
Yeah, if I sometimes say some people think accountability is the longest four-letter word in the English language, but it doesn't have to be, because really what accountability
Yeah.
ultimately is ownership, right?
Yeah.
So I love that you tying that to motivation. I love that. So uh, one more work-related question, and
Yeah.
a lot of folks who are watching or listening are their leadership context is different than it was, say, 5 years ago, because either they have folks who are fully remote or they only see some of the time. So that means some of the time, all of these questions and these skills of asking questions and building a coaching culture are all happening at a distance. Do you have any specific advice? Does anything change in our conversation, or would you put an addendum on anything we've talked about when you're doing it at a distance?
Yeah, and this actually happened when we saw a lot in the pandemic where people switched to being in that remote environment. I think you can still have a very candid, direct conversation in a remote environment. I think initially a lot of people coached in teams versus coached individually. And we really wanted to make sure that people got back to, you could do remote team conversations, but you should always still commit to doing that one to one conversation. And we always go back to the care and candor side is that you might care, but you might not be candid. So you create distance. You might be candid, but you might not care and you create dysfunction. But if you have care and you're candid, you can create those transformative environments. So I would say at a remote, always making feel like they're connected to the team. You're connecting to their contribution. You're getting them to open up because, especially people in remote environments, depending on what their role is, they can feel very siloed. They can feel very disconnected. That investment into that conversation can really pull them back together. We had multiple organizations that, was a tech company I would think of, had 7 different countries, and they just weren't used to managing people in a one-to-one environment, even if there were short conversations. It's that small investment that adds up over time. And we always use this Stephen Covey, the emotional bank account.
Yeah.
And that is huge because that just adds up over time.
100%. I agree with you 100%. A couple of things before we go. I'm going to shift gears.
Please.
I want to ask you, Dave, what you do for fun.
Fun. There is a lot. We run a lot. I do triathlons. I do duathlons.
I mean, you
And
do more than run.
a little
That
bit.
means
And
there's
I've been
swimming and
swimming quite a bit.
biking involved.
Yeah, and just got into a time trial bike this year, so it's a totally different world having your hands out on the road. And I've kind of done Brazilian jiu-jitsu for the last 12 years and got the chance to travel all over the world for Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So I wouldn't say there's a sport I haven't tried, but that's usually what keeps me stimulated is those sports: running, triathlons, duathlons, and Brazilian jiu-jitsu.
So everybody, Kevin is guilty of the stereotype. At the beginning, I said the man's from Canada, so I used I went to hockey. I messed up right from the start. So Dave, what are you reading these days when you're not running or jujitsuing?
Yeah, you know what? I actually just went and got a couple of new books last night, and I was actually avid reader, and I've been waiting to get this book for a while. And it was "Buy Back Your Time," Dan Martell, and big fan of his work. And really, as we're growing and scaling, we're trying to really put better systems in there. And the book is really just dedicated to putting better systems in place to grow and scale. And the other book that I picked up as well was the 80-20 principle, which I think is Richard Koch. And we speak to this all the time, and I'm always looking for those extra little tips, tricks, quotes. So I'm really, really looking forward to diving that one. But I'm gonna go through the "Buy Back Your Time" first. Real big advocate of what Dan does.
We'll have both of those in the show notes, along with information about radical growth. Transform into an unstoppable leader through mastering the art of questions. As I hold this up, Dave, where else Do you want to point people, or how do you want people to, if they want to connect with you, learn more about what your work, where do you want them to go?
Yeah, if you want to reach out to us on our website, ruminategroup.com. We're very active on LinkedIn as well if you want to check us out there. And same thing for Instagram. But yeah, we're excited to reach out and connect for everybody. And really appreciate being on the show and be able to promote what we've been up to. And love the questions. I'm always an advocate.
Rumin8, the numeral 8 group. So RUMIN8 group.com. For those of you that can't see it, it was on the screen, but if you're listening, that didn't help you. So before I say goodbye to Dave and before I say goodbye to you, I have the question for you that I ask you every single episode, and that is, now what? What action will you take as a result? Like, if you didn't write down 4 or 5 specific questions from Dave, you might want to replay this and do that. But whether it's that or whether it's something else that you took, what are the specific actions that you want to take as a result of being here? Because until you take action, this is not nearly as valuable as it could be. It's sitting here like soil unplanted. But once you plant the seeds and take the action, then a harvest can come your way. So, Dave, thank you so much for being here. We had a fit and start. We were planning to do this, I don't know, 6-8 weeks ago, and I'm glad that we finally got the chance to do it. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate being on.
So, everybody, if you enjoyed this, make sure you come back. How do you do that? Make sure you're subscribed wherever you're watching or listening, and make sure you tell someone else to come listen to this or listen next week, because next week we'll be back with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.